Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on a rainy Friday evening to NYU School of Law. My name is Mattathias Schwartz. I'm a journalist, and we're here to talk about the war on drugs. Is it over? And I won't be too long with my introductions. I just wanted to give a few quick thank yous and also introduce our panelists. First, I wanted to thank the sponsors of this event, N+1, and the NYU School of Law, the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law, who helped put this on and gave us this wonderful classroom to have tonight's event in. I've never seen this before, but it's pretty yeah. Yeah, that's more like it. Maybe I'd take myself down a notch. There we go. Okay, so I'm really excited about the three folks we have here this evening. First, starting on closest to me on my right is Kathleen Friedel, a historian and author of The Drug Wars in America, 1940 to 1973. Most conventional histories of the drug war begin in 1971. So this is a very interesting prehistory of a guy named Anslinger and the BNCC and how the U.S. approach to drugs changed after World War II from one of control and regulation to one of more punitive prohibition. Next, we have Hamilton Morris, who writes for Harper's and Vice magazine, an expert on psychedelic drugs and a trained chemist. Hamilton's written on such exotic and little-known drugs as gaboxidol, a gray market sleep aid, Haitian zombie poison, the psychedelic effects of efavirenz, an HIV drug, and hallucinogenic frogs. His writing is extremely precise and sober, and I'm always impressed by your capacity to be swept away by an experience and at the same time be outside of it and observing yourself being swept away, which is a rare quality. He had his first book, Bloodspore, will be published by McSweeney's in 2015. And finally, we have Cesar Gaviria, the former president of Colombia. He held that office from 1990 to 1994. That was the time during which, those were Pablo Escobar's final years. He was killed in 1993, and Gaviria's role during that very tumultuous time in Colombia's history has been immortalized in the telenovela Escobar, El Patron de Mal. But yeah, that was almost, since then, President Gaviria has served as Secretary General of the Organization of American States from 1994 to 2004. He mediated in conflicts in Colombia, Venezuela, and many other countries. He is on the board of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which published this report in 2009. I don't have the bound version. This is a printout. But it's a very forward-thinking report about adopting harm reduction strategies and trying to move away from the punitive posture that's been dominant in the U.S. for a while. And now he serves also on Oceana, an international NGO dedicated to ocean conservation. I'm going to be done very soon. I just wanted to set the stage with 4 quotes from different officials in different points in U.S. history. I'll start with the famous Nixon quote from 1971. Drugs are, quote, public enemy number 1. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. And that's from his famous War on Drugs speech. And then Ronald Reagan, 1986. We must mobilize all our forces to stop the flow of drugs into this country, to brand drugs such as marijuana exactly for what they are, dangerous. We're running up a battle flag. That's Ronald Reagan, 1986. And then another quote, a little more obscure. Casual drug users ought to be taken out and shot. That's LAPD Chief Daryl Gates in a Senate hearing in 1990. And later he explained the quote and said that he meant what he said and it wasn't taken out of context, and he felt that these people were feeding and supporting the enemy. And then finally, not too long ago, Mr. David Remnick was riding in a car with our current president, Barack Obama, who said to him that marijuana is, quote, not very different from cigarettes. I don't think it is more dangerous than alcohol. So this is a pretty broad arc. I mean, there's a big difference between public enemy number one and taking people out and shooting them and something not being different from cigarettes. So I thought we'd start with you, President Gaviria. Does this mean that the war on drugs is over?
No, the war on drugs is not over. I mean, hundreds of people, not to talk about thousands of people, are being killed in the war on drugs at this moment in Central America and Mexico and Colombia. It's still a big fight. What has changed significantly in the last 5 years, it's that from having an issue that was a taboo, we at the Commission promoted even a documentary called Breaking the Taboo, because it was like bad talking about drugs. It was bad seeing you were suspicious of talking about drugs, to an issue in which no one in this country really defends prohibitionism anymore. Not the people of the Drug Enforcement Administration or Homeland Security or SAR, Office of SAR. They don't put their face to defend prohibitionism really. They just talk about arguments, say, well, those statistics are not exactly right. That's what they have to say. But they don't have arguments anymore. To end up this introduction, when Vice President Biden was sent by President Obama before the last summit of Presidents of the Americas to talk to Central American presidents that were starting to talk about legalization of drugs and things like that. And so he wanted to defend U.S. policy. A journalist asked him, Vice President Biden, what do you think about the legalization of all drugs? And so he says like this, he said, well, we can be worse than we are now. That was the very strong defense he did of prohibitionism. We could be worse. Yes, of course, we could be worse. I mean, if one day we just decide to totally change policy. Policy on drugs needs research, needs ideas, needs to look to other experiences. Drugs is a very complex issue. Very, very complex. It's not easy to learn. The issues of law enforcement are totally different of the issues of prevention or treatment or anything like that. And you need to take that. There is no simple solutions to the problem of drugs. But there are, as the European says, and I think that has been very fortunate about the Europeans, they don't talk about good policies. They talk about reduction of harm. What is less bad for society, doing this or this? What is less bad for society? And you take the less bad for society. You don't take something that is good or that is simple or have answers for every question. You just take what is less bad for society. And less bad means less corruption, less violence, less money in jails, and something that has not been useful. I think that's been fortunate, because you will never get a policy that answers every question, that you can defend as very good, very effective, that will solve all problems. No one can offer you that. But you can improve what you have. You can do many things that are less bad or better for society, or what you do today.
Okay, there's a lot there that I want to ask you about. But first, I want to go to Hamilton and ask just the title question: Is the war on drugs over?
Yes, I would have to agree that it is not over at all. In light of the ridiculous heights of irrationality that existed in the past, it does seem like there's been some improvement, especially when you look at what the U.S. was like in the 70s and 80s with Ross Perot flying around in a helicopter looking for people smoking weed and paying vigilantes to arrest anyone using drugs, all this stuff was
Ross,
so
he paid vigilantes to arrest. I didn't know.
pay
Yeah.
for the legal defense of anyone that informed on a drug user out of pocket.
Wow.
And this was considered like a very American, patriotic thing to be doing. Anyways, there's endless examples of just how ridiculous things were in the past, and in light of that, when you see things like cannabis being legalized in Colorado, it can be very encouraging, and it makes you feel a little bit optimistic. But even things like that are still ramifications of an underlying problem that I still don't feel is being addressed entirely. It's certainly an improvement, but it's also something that primarily impacts middle-class white Americans. It doesn't address a lot of the racial issues that underpin the drug war, and there's still a lot that needs to change, and I don't think that just decriminalizing cannabis is going to solve the problem. And the same is true internationally. If you look, I don't know if anyone here has been following what's happening in New Zealand at the moment, but there's some really interesting developments happening where what would generally be called designer drugs or gray market drugs are now legal to be sold for human consumption as recreational drugs. This is the first time in history something like this has happened. There's no medical pretense. They're not made for treating any sort of disorder. These are drugs being sold exclusively to make people feel good. And so on one hand, this seems like a very sophisticated, advanced way of dealing with the problem. But on the other hand, they still haven't legalized cannabis. They still haven't legalized the drugs that a lot of these gray market substances are replacing. And even though they're trying to elevate the gray market to a pharmaceutical standard, I don't truly believe that they are. And I think that it may be less harmful than selling these things as bath salts or potpourri, but it's certainly more harmful than allowing people access to the drugs that they wanted in the first place.
Thank you. So Kathleen, again, the title question, is the war on drugs over?
Well, it seems like we have a unanimous panel here. The war on drugs is not over. I want to thank Matt for organizing this panel, and he gave a summary of my book, but I want to expand on really the central intervention of it so I can answer that question properly. And that is, I argue in my book the reason why the United States went from a regulatory and taxing and tariff regime to regulate narcotics that are today illicit, the reason why it went from that regime to a criminal punishment regime of prohibition and the kind of prison industrial complex that we have today is because the drug war policy portfolio and ratcheting up punishment within that performed other valued tasks for the state. And that is to say that throughout the developing world, the drug war policy portfolio has been a central rationalization for intervention there, a way to funnel and channel resources, create alliances, break alliances. And within the United States, ratcheting up punishment served as a sign of central mechanism that changed policing in this country, which was in the hands of a largely white police force accustomed to discretionary tools that were being taken away from them as a result of the civil rights movement from outside of it, and as a result of the police professionalization movement from within it. The drug war and the kind of discretionary tools that it provided replaced the kind of historical tools that police had been accustomed to using within especially inner cities. So something I say to describe the book a lot is the central and defining addiction of the drug war is the government's addiction to a punishment regime. And unless we confront the government's addiction to the drug war, which means de facto confronting prohibition, we will not be rid of the drug war. And the only kind of segment within which, and it's been already alluded to, I've seen kind of any significant headway being made is the marijuana policy portfolio, where the rationale of prohibition is being challenged on every level. But I want to very quickly agree with Hamilton that the drug war, as it's been mobilized by the U.S. government, has featured so many racial and class biases within it that it would really be a shame if the drug reform movement kind of mimicked those race and class biases and failed to give attention to these other kinds of reforms that challenge prohibition in other areas outside of marijuana.
Thank you. Let me start with, there's a lot for me to follow up on here, a lot more than we'll have time to get through even already. But I wanted to follow up on something you said, President Gaviria, when these new statements that President Obama is making about marijuana, and when he, commutes the sentences of 8 people who've been convicted of crack cocaine. How are moves like that perceived outside of the United States, in Colombia and elsewhere? And do people think that this may eventually lead to a different foreign policy, or is it more 2 separate spheres? Or
No, it was surprising how low was in the news in the U.S. to start with. It was not big all over because it was not big in the U.S. Like media agree on putting some silence on this. That was not important.
But the
Just a
Colombia and
comment of the
Washington,
But of course, it had it was big news in countries where this issue is big. Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia.
but the Colorado and Washington, I mean, the legal, that's big news.
I imagine it was. But we have to realize one thing. There is not a good debate in the U.S. The debate in the U.S. is very poor. And why is very poor? Because the elite of this country is not talking about this. I'm talking about politicians and journalists and people who are influential in this country. And they are not talking about this. The debate on drugs is going like silent through citizens, but there's not a big debate. There is no senator talking about drugs.
But there are people talking about marijuana there quite a bit right now.
But the debate on the policy on drugs is still not as profound and as serious as it should be.
What would you like to see? What questions should people be
a
asking?
real discussion. I don't know why senators and governors and secretaries and all of them talk about the issue. Why they should be silent? After Colorado and Washington, all the Republicans and all the Democrats just shut down. They didn't say anything at all. They were totally silent until the Department of Justice, 6 months after that, started to say, yes, we are going to let go. And I thought, well, someone is going to answer that this is crazy or that this is good or that this is bad. Nothing happened. People prefer not to say anything. I mean, it's not a minor issue, but it was incredible. A 6-month period without no one saying anything. Just, well, what is the policy of government? I met several U.S. ambassadors saying, well, we are waiting for instructions. That's all they have to say. And of course, the instructions didn't come after many months after that. I mean, that is a poor debate. People don't want to face the issue because they know why this is happening. Because people are tired of policy. They know it's ineffective. It's not even that they like legalization. It's that 70-something, I think close to 80%, consider that the war on drugs failed, there is a failed policy, and they are changing because it's a failed policy, but they don't really have been part of an interesting debate, an open debate, because when you are part of the elite of a country, being a journalist, being a senator, being whatever, you have the obligation to talk about issues. You cannot let the people just go silent and do whatever they want. All of them keep silent. They don't say anything. And I think this is not good. Why it will take longer than it should, the war on drugs to end? Because there's a lot of cowardice in the political class, in the elite of this country, about talking on this issue.
I mean, you talk about the war on drugs being a failure, and I know this is cited in the Commission's report, like that's a settled matter. I mean, a lot of people would say that the U.S. homicide rate's about half what it was in 1970 or 1980, and the volume of cocaine that enters the United States now is lower than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So,
yes,
I mean, there are... So is it open and closed and it's a failure?
If you compare numbers with the heights of the 70s, yes, a lot has changed.
It was a 20, 30-year spike, 70
Yes.
and
But
the 90s.
in the last 20 years, nothing has really happened. Some people have moved from cocaine to methamphetamines. There are more addicts to methamphetamines than to cocaine today in the U.S., more addicts. So people have moved one drug to the next one, the balloon effect. But that's all that happened. consumption is basically at levels, consumption of drugs is basically at the same level that was 20 years ago. And is the highest in the world, at least if you compare with the European countries and Latin American countries. Even with the very tough policy the US has, having more people in jail than all European countries, 25 countries of the big Europe. There are more people for drugs in the US than all the prisoners of Europe.
So why don't we stick with this the failure thing for a moment, and I'll throw this out either Kathleen or Hamilton. You can is it a failure, and if you do think it is, how can we be so sure? How do we know that it wouldn't be worse if there weren't this massive enforcement and incarceration regime?
Well, it's absolutely a failure, yes, because it's just it's completely predicated on this false idea that it's a criminal problem as opposed to a medical problem. So it could never succeed. There's no way that the way it is currently constructed, it could ever address the problem that it's trying to address.
Oh yeah, please, yeah.
No, it's the comparison. The Europeans have softer policies, more liberal policies. They don't put people in jail out of Sweden. They have less consumption, less violence, less criminal. I mean, it's easy to compare. People in the US think that you have to imagine what will happen if we do this. Well, go to Portugal and see what happened. Nothing bad. The levels of consumption are not higher. People have moved from hard drugs to softer drugs. The health system is able to deal with all this. If you are a Portuguese citizen, you can go any hospital with no fear to say, am I an addict? Can you help me? And they do it. I mean, you don't need to imagine
So then
what
these
is going to
programs,
happen. They have lower levels of consumption.
Well, just a second. And then, so these programs have been out there for a while, and the data has been out there for a while,
Yeah.
and still you have Vice President Biden saying, this isn't the worst we can do. Why? And you talked about this, the taboo. Why is it that people are so afraid to talk about this? What is it? Yeah, please.
Can I jump in? Because I tend to agree with the president that the quality of the debate in the United States at the official level does not reflect the kind of discord and debate that exists among all of us. And I think that there are three reasons for that. One is that I might be right. That is, there's tremendous inside the Beltway buy-in to the drug war policy portfolio in order to accomplish global and domestic objectives that are very important to the U.S. government. But I think there are other reasons as well. One very important facet of the drug war, and it's been mentioned already, is that, not everyone's fought in this drug war. At the end of my book, I kind of compare it to the Vietnam War in the sense that not everyone served. Its costs have been very selectively imposed. And to the extent that those costs have been imposed on certain neighborhoods or certain countries, those neighborhoods and those countries lie well outside the corridors of power. So I think that's another reason. Finally, there's a very kind of explicit and technical reason why the debate is such a poor quality, and that is the ONDCP is actually exempted from a White House-wide or executive branch-wide, if you will, directive on scientific policy and the quality of scientific research. The ONDCP does not have to subscribe to those standards and is specifically prohibited from pursuing research that discusses or addresses legalization in any way. Every American should be upset about that.
Is there like a law, or who prohibits them from this?
It's in 2009, it's an executive order that exempted the ONDCP from these scientific standards, and they are not allowed to pursue research, including social science research. I'm not sure, if they would read my book, they couldn't use it in any of their official policy or discourse. So there are different layers of reasonings about why the quality of the debate in the United States at the official level has not reflected the debate that's taking place around KitchenAid tables and things like that.
Hamilton, I want to ask you about a moment in your film about efavirenz use in Johannesburg. I guess it's a drug that's normally used to treat HIV, but then people mix it with rat poison and opiates and make this homebrewed concoction. Do I have that about right?
Yeah.
So you met a lot of these people, and you were back in sort of the rooms where they're doing this, and it's not a nice neighborhood, and some of the people you met seem really desperate. I mean, they're smoking literally rat poison in front of you, and one guy you talked to seemed really full of regret, and he was talking about what he used to look like in his old pictures and how his weight's changed and his body's changed, and so I wanted to ask you what are the root causes of addiction, of harmful drugs, and is there any role that the state should play in mitigating those causes?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
But
Or any one of you three. Yeah.
and there's a big difference between drug use and addiction, and I think that a lot of people would say that there's an innate human drive for intoxication that's not necessarily some sign of pathology, that it's completely healthy and normal.
I'm trying to sort of set the innocuous recreational use to the side and then focus on the people who even say for
Well,
themselves
that's
it's
kind
a
of a
problem.
weird
Yeah.
example. The use of efavirenz recreationally in South Africa is maybe not the best because it's unclear exactly how prevalent it is and how much of a public health risk it is and what people's motivations for doing it are and how much of it is a journalistic construction. And so I almost feel like that specific example is too complicated to use to represent drug
Okay, well, heroin in Vermont then.
heroin in Vermont.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Even that, I don't even.
No, I mean, there's like an epidemic
I know,
happening and
I've
people.
heard a little bit about this, but.
Is this all media construction or is it actually happening? I mean, I haven't been to
this sort of
Vermont,
gets
so.
back to the question of silence or ambivalence politically and journalistically relating to the drug war. And I think that one thing you have to keep in mind with journalists is that journalism is not ideologically motivated. It's motivated by what I think of as just what's interesting, what's controversial, what will get clicks. And so when cannabis was legalized in Colorado, what I felt was that the people writing about it had no agenda to make it seem good or bad. It was just whatever would make the most interesting story. So if a teenager, and I don't know if this has happened, but it's like hypothetically, if a teenager gets high and gets into a car accident and kills a family or something, then that's a story. Then they're going to write, oh, maybe it wasn't such a good idea after all. A family just died. They were hit by a stoned teenager. Maybe we should rethink this policy because that's the good story. On the other hand, if some statistic comes out that says, oh, it turns out that lung cancer is reduced by 10% or something like that, then that's the story. Then that becomes what is written about. And right now, it's all so new that people don't even know what to think yet. I think that it's going to take a couple of years before people can even take any sort of stand and have a perspective on it that's really informed. It's been such a short period of time. But the question of why people use heroin in Vermont?
No. Does the state have a role ever in when people have a serious problem in trying to mitigate that?
I think they have a medical responsibility in helping people who want treatment to get that.
I see.
treatment.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes, I think the main problem we have today is that when all countries, and that is change of policy that the U.S. Took the initiative on, the 61 Convention of the UN system had a purpose. And in 71, in 88, 98, 2 years ago, always, we are going to live in a world free of drugs. A totally utopian and unrealistic purpose. And they have been saying a lie to everyone for 50 years. And that is totally, and then what accompanied that was a total ban on science, a total ban on information, a total ban on statistics, a total ban on everything. There is a total, I think that's a lot of ignorance, including ourselves, about drugs. You don't know how damaging cocaine is, because there is no research, because you cannot use resources in research. We don't really know. I mean, yes, we know a little bit, but we don't really know, and we don't really know about marijuana either. We know that it's less damaging than alcohol. Yeah, I think we think that, but how damaging it is, we don't know because there is not enough research. So the real problem is living in a totally false idea that we were able. No, people have used drugs through millenniums, through centuries, over in different societies, in different timings. It's totally unrealistic to think that you are going to stop that all over. It's unrealistic. So it's much better to work in regulation, in research, in educating people, in saying what is very damaging and what is not, which are the risks you take when you do this, which are the real risks you take. That's what you need to do.
Let me jump in.
Legalization is a bad word.
Let me
And I
jump
want
in.
to say it here.
But I want to jump back to 1992 and 1993 when Pablo Escobar was at the height of his power, and he was, some people said he was the 8th or 9th richest man in the world, and you were president of Colombia, and he was causing all kinds of security problems and kidnapping people and bombing people, and then Colombia, with the help of the U.S., when you were president, was able to take him out. And I imagine, you know, in order to have that happen, you must have been working pretty closely with the U.S. And what I want to ask you is, was there at any point that you had a change of heart, or where you felt, or did you feel this way back in '92, or what?
I still think that you cannot try to sell the policy that you should not fight cartels. I mean, that is not something I believe in.
So you should fight cartels.
You need to do that. What you need to look is at consumption as a health problem, and start working on that and trying to reduce the size of the business. If you provide drugs to people on the basis of help, of the health system, if you provide them, if you regulate the consumption of marijuana, if you can provide, you know, let's look to heroin. The problem of the
If we decriminalize cocaine, what would happen to the cartels then? Or they wouldn't just go away? How would you manage them?
Yes, but you have, I mean, you need to have into consideration public opinion. You need to have a policy that people can believe in, that you can prove is much better. And you have a lot of examples. Let's go to a better example, that is heroin. It's very difficult to cure a person who is addicted to heroin. You know it better than I do. It's very difficult. But if you are a Swiss citizen, you can go to a hospital, they put a shot of heroin, and you go to work. If you are a good citizen and you do your job, they just help you to deal with the, and they accept that the doctors do that. You know, this problem of Hoffman that died of a heroin shot, what happened? There is news of 2 months before that, and Ethan probably remembered that the consumption of heroin in eastern United States, up-eastern United States, was already on a high. Why? Because people don't get prescription of painkillers. So it's much easier to go and buy heroin, illegal heroin in the market. That shows how bad the policy is. It would be much better to have doctors the capacity to say, well, you can consume heroin or you can consume this painkiller, I will keep you, I will send you, I will help you. No, just do that. So, because people cannot find painkillers, and that's one of the things that is happening in New York and in Maryland and some of the state here, is people don't get painkillers, doctors to prescribe painkillers, they go and buy something that is very easy to get, illegal heroin. That's what prohibition takes you. At the end, what you get is that. You get results that you never imagined, you never expected. People just go illegal. It's much easier for a young guy in college to buy marijuana than to buy alcohol.
Yeah,
So,
caffeine,
I
please,
mean,
yeah.
he has no chance. He buys marijuana because he has no chance. If we would like to take alcohol, no, he has to take marijuana because he cannot take alcohol.
has to take
It's-
marijuana.
Yeah.
So it's mad, but it's like that. Because you don't get the Rivotril, then you get illegal heroin. I mean, that's what a policy of ignorance takes to. Because it's a policy of ignorance. Let's don't know, everything is bad, everything is banned. Let's not do any research. Let's keep people in ignorance, in total ignorance of what is damaging and what is not.
Please, yeah.
I just want to circle back to a couple of things that were said. I don't quibble with Hamilton's characterization of the journalist profession, but I think that there is a distinction to be made among professional journalists, particularly inside the Beltway journalists or others who rely on access for their stories. And I think one example of this, and I hate to step on New York toes here, but one example of this is the David Remnick interview that you've already cited with President Obama, because a lot of us read that interview, which was very long and detailed, and came to the remarks that he made about marijuana. And a follow-up question that any drug reformer would have had after the president announced that he just really didn't feel marijuana was any more or less dangerous than alcohol would be, then why the hell don't you take it off of Schedule I drug prohibition? And we're still wondering, why in the hell don't you take it off of Schedule I drug prohibition? It's completely within the executive's power to do that. And that question went unasked. So there's a lot of questions, I think, that go unasked when a journalist is relying upon access for stories, and I think a majority of them, frankly, do. When Matt asked about what is the state's responsibility towards the addict, I think it's a very good question, and I personally would like to see that responsibility affirmed and primarily enacted through the Affordable Care Act, which I think extends tremendous possibilities, I should say, to treat addiction. And I think we're very much in need of a kind of professional renaissance within the medical profession regarding addiction. Addiction accounts for 1 out of every $14 spent in the healthcare system. Addiction is an incredibly costly untreated addiction is an incredibly costly problem. And there's every reason to think and hope that treating addiction, screening for it much more regularly and much more routinely would save the entire healthcare system money and would be a venue that, if it didn't result in this kind of happy ending every time, it would at least achieve outcomes that the president has already cited are achieved in Portugal every day. Harm reduction outcomes that really do matter to public health system, reduced infection rates of HIV, for example, reduced addiction rates among teenagers. There are very important outcomes that a public health model delivers and has been shown to deliver, and I would prefer to see the state's responsibility to the addict, as you put it, enacted primarily through the healthcare venue rather than the criminal justice venue.
Can I ask a question?
Well, I think we're maybe 15, 20 minutes, but you're first, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that the solution to a lot of these problems isn't all that complicated a lot of the time. Addiction is a very complicated thing, but for example, there's a drug called naloxone that very effectively treats opioid overdoses. This is not a new drug. It was first synthesized in 1960. It's been used clinically for decades, but it wasn't until yesterday that the FDA approved it as a treatment for opioid overdose that could be dispensed as an auto-injector to people at risk for that sort of thing. And more people die of drug overdoses in the US than car accidents. So this is like a really easy way to treat a very significant problem with a known intervention that just had been withheld until yesterday.
But it's no longer being withheld.
Yeah, so again,
So I'm hearing that you guys are not altogether happy with the status quo. Am I being too okay? But there are these baby steps happening with Holder not interfering with Colorado and Washington, with this auto injector that was approved yesterday, with the commuting of the sentences of 8 out of the 300,000 criminals currently incarcerated at the state and federal level for drug offenses. So is this rolling, and where's it going to stop? I mean, the marijuana thing does strike me as a big deal. I mean, that's what I was getting at with the quotes, is that from the Nixon days, this was a real serious thing, and people were presenting it as poison, and so wait, now is the dam going to break open now, or what?
It's very good. It would be much better if there was a much more intelligent discussion about the issue all over, because I don't know. I mean, people are like waiting the news to see what is interesting about this news, but there is not a significant effort to tell people why this is a good policy. It's not that citizens decided. It's that is the right policy to follow. It's the right you have to defend what is happening, not just accept what citizens have decided. You have to defend what is happening. And when I am talking about journalists, I'm not talking just of a journalist of a New York Times. I am talking about the editorial board of the New York Times. Why they didn't come with a strong editorial after the New Yorker article of President Obama, about President Obama, of Remnick, of President Obama. Why? Why, if they know that the policy is bad? Because I know, when we did this meeting, the New York Times came very favorably to this. And as did the Financial Times and the Economist. I mean,
This is when
the
you did your
economic
report,
establishment. Paul Volcker is part of our commission. He's a very respected guy. So it's not so difficult to come with an editorial saying, well, this is a good step. We should change the policy, but everybody's silent about that. And that is not good. Why they are silent? If they can talk about it, they can defend what is happening. They can say it's not a certain and very good road. No, it's a risk we should take, because you have to start to say things in the appropriate language. It's not that Colorado and Washington have no risks. Yes, they have risks, and some bad things can happen. But it's a risk you have to take, as the Europeans did, to move to a policy that's much more intelligent. And you keep in a trial and error, doing research, looking what happens, helping people. It's not just regulation. You need to organize teachers, because you have to defeat consumption of drugs as you are defeating cigarettes. I mean, nicotine is much more addictive than cocaine or marijuana. I mean, of course it's more. And just to social pressure has been reduced significantly because of social pressure, because of information, because of prevention. That's what you need to do with drugs, because drugs are bad. All drugs are bad. It's not that you're going to defend. I am not libertarian. I am not of the idea that just let people consume drugs. No, no. The idea is you have to inform people what is the damage that drugs can bring and what you should be careful about and what is addictive. And certain types of personalities, of characters are very vulnerable, as you know. It's not everyone. It's not everyone that is very vulnerable. There are some people that are much more vulnerable.
There's something
And you have to be
said,
aware
I think,
of that.
you said something that I think is a very interesting point of entry. All drugs are bad.
Yeah.
You know, let's open that one up. Yeah, I mean, that's your...
No, from the libertarian point of view, you can say, well, yes, it's my right. I can do harm to myself. It doesn't matter. But if you want to build up a policy that is intelligent enough and you can sell to fathers and doctors and everyone, you have to come with a statement that I think is true. I mean, addictions and drugs are bad, and all drugs are bad. All drugs of stimulants or whatever they are bad. They are not good. But the solution is not prohibition. The solution is regulation, research, trial and error, taking risks, looking at other
How far would you
experiences.
like to see it go based on, you know, all the research that your group's done? What would be a efficient endpoint for you know, as we look at these things and loosen prohibition? How far would you like to see it loosened?
You know, I tend to agree with him in one thing. You know, the solution to the problem of heroin is very simple. You authorize doctors to prescribe heroin to people if they are addicted under certain conditions. And at that moment, the illegal market will disappear, and the problem of violence and corruption will disappear.
Well, we come
Of course,
from-
you need a special legislation, particularly in this country. But if you want to deal with that in a much more intelligent way, instead of getting heroin in any street of New York or any place in an illegal way, it will be much better if doctors can do it.
But we have that.
And this is the most complex of problems.
We have that right now with OxyContin. It's not quite heroin, but it's not, you know, and doctors can prescribe it if they want, you know, if they
But they
and
can't prescribe for
Bufirena-
addiction. They can't prescribe for addiction. I think
Not
that's
for
what he means.
addiction. Okay, yeah.
Not for addiction. You need to
Be able to
design a
prescribe for
policy for
addiction.
addiction. You can do it for addiction, but you have doctors on people helping people to deal with an addiction, not getting illegal drugs in the market from mafias.
So yeah, why
Even
didn't?
you can do that with cocaine if you want it. You can introduce doctors to the consumption of cocaine if you want to. You can do it, and it will be much better than what we have today.
Hamilton, I'd like you to respond if you, yeah.
I would
mine is-
disagree
I
about
think-
all drugs being bad. I think it's not necessarily good to make those sorts of value judgments because they're just chemicals that exist within a cultural matrix and they don't really have any, you know, every drug has an ambivalent potential. It can be anything. Cocaine is a perfect example. When pure cocaine hydrochloride is snorted, it's generally problematic for habitual users. When coca leaves are chewed, traditionally, it's not problematic at all. It's not associated with cardiotoxicity, it's not associated with any sort of significant addiction. It may even have health benefits. And so the line between a drug and a medicine is not a clear line. And I think if you just...
But that is a very technical thing. If you want to talk about public policy, you need statements that are credible for everyone and you can sell. If you start to say drugs are bad, people will be much more open in their minds. That if you say, no, some drugs are not that bad, you can let people go. No.
Yeah, but this is
I think I do agree with you. I do agree. And I have some sympathy for some libertarian arguments. But to have
This is
a
the taboo
public
you were talking
policy-
about,
Yeah.
right? This is the
To have-
taboo.
I mean, he's
Yeah.
libertarian, for example.
Mr. Nadelman,
Libertarian,
yeah.
And he defends some who are very libertarian. But I think from the point of view of public policy, it's better to start saying, well, drugs are bad. And the society and the state has the obligation to tell people what is damaging in drugs, what risks you take when you take drugs, or how frequent, of from which source. Yes, that is.
So,
the
if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is we need to say that all drugs are bad in order to get anywhere on the policy issue. Because if you start splitting hairs about which drugs are good or bad, then it just gets too complicated for
No,
the.
you have to tell people that cigarettes are bad, that alcohol are bad, also, so they realize that they are drugs. People don't think that alcohol are drugs. People sometimes don't think that nicotine and cigarettes are drugs.
Well, there was
you have
a-
to start with telling them, hey, those are drugs. Those are drugs also. And it's not that it's good.
It does
It's
seem
that
like
you deal with them with regulation.
I mean, there was some poll data. There was some poll data that Pew released this week that shows that compared to alcohol, the U.S. public thinks that marijuana is actually relatively innocuous. That they agree with, they're tracking with the president or vice versa on this, and that people do seem to have come around on.
That is one thing about marijuana. People are much less aggressive on marijuana than on alcohol. People don't become aggressive. On alcohol, people become aggressive. Most people become very aggressive. In marijuana, that doesn't happen. We know for society, no doubt there's less risk in marijuana than alcohol. I have no doubt. And I haven't seen any research doing that is more damaging for your brain or anything like that. I haven't seen it. Maybe it will exist because there is no research. We don't know. We don't know yet. Because
Kathleen,
research has been almost banned all through these years.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the chemical makeup of a drug and its psychopharmacology and effect on the brain, and at what point are its effects determined by that, and at what point are they determined by law, sentence setting, social norms, et cetera?
Right. I mean, I think for me, as somebody who's agnostic about drugs and does not feel particularly well qualified to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on any given drug profile, I think that the leverage for critique of our current drug war, if one is searching for that, is in a relative and not an absolute moral sense. That is to say, if heroin is illegal and OxyContin is legal, explain to me pharmacologically why. And to draw these sorts of relative comparisons, there's no reason, scientifically speaking, to isolate out a certain class of drugs. Those reasons are historical and they're political in nature, and I trace them in my book. And I want to actually return to something in my book because it addresses something that we discussed early and maybe should pay a little more attention to, which is this kind of current reform moment that we're in. I hate to be so dogmatic. I often criticize my friends on the left who, if a union is formed, they don't like it. If it's an employer, run union or friendly to the employers or whatever, they want everything done their way. And I often tell them that people who are interested in kind of dogmatic solutions, their way or the highway, to me are more interested in power than they are in progress. And I like to take my progress wherever I can get it. And these incremental steps that the Obama administration has taken are meaningful, and I don't mean to dismiss them. My quibble is we are at a moment that resembles so very much another moment that I address in my book called the Kennedy Commission, when John F. Kennedy said, you know what, we're ratcheting up the punishment for these drug laws way too much, and we're investing too much power in punitive offices, and it doesn't seem to be having much of an effect. So I'm going to convene a panel of experts and review and revise this whole drug war. And we can see ways in which Obama has replicated and many times tried to emulate John F. Kennedy office in countless numbers of ways. And it's eerie to me how closely the rhetoric of the Obama administration matches that of the Kennedy Commission, which is to say, let's treat the addict and chase the criminal dealer. The results of the reforms, many of which were incremental from the Kennedy Commission, ultimately wound up ratifying the punishment regime even more so, because the more you chase the trafficker under a regime of prohibition, the more you're going to rely on confidential informants and things like that, who are, addicts by nature a lot of the time. And there's just no way to enact a regime of prohibition while also kind of compassionately dealing with the addict. It's just a contradiction in terms. So I don't mean to sound so dogmatic or dismissive about what the Obama administration is doing, because I think any step, even having police officers carrying the drug that Hamilton discussed when somebody's going through an opioid addiction, or Good Samaritan laws, where somebody's not punished for dialing 911 when there's an overdose in their midst. Many times people are fearful of that punishment because they themselves are using drugs. All of these things matter, because all of these things, lives are at stake. And I don't mean to be dismissive of them. I just truly believe, based on the research that I've done, there's a limit to the progress that can be achieved as long as we're under a kind of a prohibition regime.
When Sikorski, what is the name of the drug czar, came with his statement about drug policy 6 years ago.
Kurlikowski or?
Yeah, yes. When he came with his first statement, it's very good. Had no relevance. It was not on the news. Nobody cared. But the statement of 6 years ago of drugs and what a drug policy should be, and talking about that it was impossible to stop drugs in the source, in producing countries. I mean, the statement is very good, as is the drug. But what happens is society doesn't want to give relevance to that, want to ignore that. There is like escapism about the issue of drugs. No, escapism. This society has some kind of escapism to talk about drugs, because people just try to avoid to talk about that. Politicians, important journalists, it's an escapism. I don't understand what is happening, but in that way, it's a lot of money, a lot of resources, not a minor problem. No, I was talking to a professor of a university the other day and say, well, we are comfortable with things that are happening. It's not so serious. Say, well, you don't care about the 60-something thousand people that were killed in Mexico? It's not that important to you? I mean, if you are comfortable here, you don't care about thousands of people killed here just in the border? So he got upset. He said, wait, sorry. You have to discuss about those things. You have to care the people that have been killed. Thousands of people killed because of your policy. Because the problem is because of U.S. policy in relation to consumption. The things are as they are. So, and that's what needs to be stopped is the policy about consumption of the U.S. and telling and selling to people not the idea of legalization, which I think has long limitations. What you have to tell people, this is a health problem. The consumption of drugs is a health problem. Addiction is a health problem. You have to, if you start accepting that this is a health problem, solutions will be totally different. You have a big change when people accept that this is a health problem. And that's what the Portuguese did. This is a health problem. That's it. And policy changed dramatically because they decided that. Not that if the legalization is a good or bad idea, is that this is a health problem.
And I know when the U.S. talks about drugs and why we need to stay in the war on drugs, from the ONDCP and the DA on down, they talk a lot about the cartels and the Zetas and violence and narco-terrorism. Is that what they're...
You start talking about that. That is not the issue. The issue is not that you should fight the cartels. The issue is about consumption. Should you deal with the consumption in a different way? You have to start somewhere. And the way to start is not saying that you should not look for Chapo Guzman or Pablo Escobar. That is not the issue to begin with.
So should they be looking for
consumption?
them?
The issue is consumption. Consumption is the issue. You have to deal with consumption in a totally different way. That is a health problem, and you have to deal with the problem as a health problem.
Let's talk about Chapo Guzman for a moment. So you know, it's been 20 years since Escobar, and now we've got Guzman, and there's sort of an ever extending chain of these guys. Are operations like that constructive? Do they help?
Are constructive.
I hear what you're saying about the consumption.
I'll tell you, when you are in the situation of Mexico or Colombia or Honduras or so, whatever, and you have this huge problem, you have to fight, because otherwise these people become all powerful. So, and you cannot accept they'll become all powerful. Escobar was becoming all powerful, like Chapo Guzman and some of these guys. So you have no alternative. You have to fight, because you have to contain that. And without Colombia or Mexico, the U.S. has no policy to start with. I mean, without the cooperation of Colombia or Mexico, there is no policy in the U.S.
What do you explain? I don't.
Oh, yeah. The policy of the U.S. will fail, totally fail.
Without the
day that
cooperation.
Mexico or Colombia say, we will not cooperate. That is your problem.
And why do they
You have no
continue?
policy.
Why do they continue to cooperate? I mean, it's been
Well,
pretty. Yeah.
because we are part of the international community, because we have a lot of things to lose, because it's not so easy to take that decision, and because the opinion about the drug issue are changing fast.
Do
This
arms
was not true 5 years
do
ago.
arms get twisted? Were there ever moments when you were president where you felt like the U.S. was asking you to do something you maybe
We
didn't?
only thought in surviving. I mean, the killing Escobar was a matter of survival. It was not something theoretical. It was that he was defying the institutions and democracy and the state. He was very rich and he had a clandestine organization. We had to fight him. But the issue is not that. The issue is not about fighting or not fighting the cartels. The issue is how to deal with consumption. That is the real issue you have to start.
I want to get back to is withholding cooperation really an option for Colombia or Mexico?
No. No.
Oh, yeah,
it's
yeah,
not.
please,
That
please.
is a difficult decision to take. No, it's not. And people do not agree. I mean, people in Colombia or in Mexico are not thinking in that. It's not. I mean, people really believe that they have to fight. But at the same time, they already realize that the policy of the U.S. on consumption is wrong. It's wrong, and that the U.S. should change it. And that is the reason why the debate in the U.S. is so important. Not only the decisions by citizens in Colorado and Washington, but having a real debate in the U.S. is very important for us. Very important. We should see that they are concerned about the consequences of their policy. We should know. We should know that they really care about that.
I mean, I know you want to turn it over to questions soon, Matt, but I just want to jump in and say during the time period that I study, and it's mainly to do with Mexico, I just want to point out that there's different levels of cooperation. And there's a way in which when drug money or drug operations are run in Mexico, you can have a cooperative, and regime in full earnestness, or you could have a regime that instead of chasing the heroin dealers that the DEA wants chased, they'll chase the marijuana dealers because the marijuana dealers are in the area of the country where their political opposition comes from. In other words, when you surrender all kinds of money and tools and whatnot to a different country, you're doing just that. You're surrendering it. And you're always going to be subject to the whims of any given regime, any given country. And those preferences, those political preferences, may not align very well with drug interdiction, and they may not align very well with democratic movements throughout Latin America. They may not align well with any number of things, but you are surrendering those tools over to that regime. And there's just different levels of cooperation, some of which is, more earnest and some of which is more facile.
Yeah.
We already have that the government of Venezuela does not cooperate with drug policy. We already have a president in Bolivia that does not cooperate with
Uruguay,
the
yeah.
policy of. Things are happening. Things are happening. It's not nothing is going to happen. If the U.S. doesn't move, doesn't have a more intelligent policy, you need at least the U.S. to have a policy that is able to defend. Today, there is no one in the administration. We don't have here a person of Drug Enforcement Administration or Homeland Security.
I thought we
or
would.
the
It was a change of
Drug-
plans, yeah.
No, we don't have them because they don't want to put their face. They have nothing to defend. They don't have arguments. all they are able to say is that, oh, those statistics are not right. They don't have, I mean, if you have a policy with so many consequences, you need people that can defend the policy and say this policy is the right policy. No one in the US is saying, no one in the administration is able to do that anymore. You don't get a guy, it's not you. No one that is organizing a conference is able to get a guy that put here his face and say, well, I'm going to defend the policy we have in place. No one.
Yeah, I should have said at the beginning, I did invite the drug czar, and he did say that he was going to come, and his press guy did send me a photo to put on the flyer, and then I found out at the very last minute that he couldn't for whatever reason, and then I said, would you like to send anyone else? And the guy said, well, there's no. I was like, well, why don't you come? You seem really smart, and we're good friends. And he said, I really can't come either. It wouldn't be right for President Gaviria. And then I was like, well, it's okay with President Gaviria. And then he was like, well, I'm sorry, Matt, I just can't do it. And I did my best. So, no, you're right. They didn't want to, yeah.
They don't want to come because they are not able to defend what they have in place, what they do. So at least a country like this, I mean, why don't they have a policy they are able to defend?
Yeah, it's a good question.
And they don't
Yeah.
have it. Not even the enforcement.
Well, it's moving. I think it's moving so
are
quickly.
able to put their face anymore.
No one knows if
because
you-
when they have the questions of Colorado and Washington, they have nothing to say. Nothing to say. Or when they are asked about the interview of President Obama, they have nothing to say. So they cannot put their face. They cannot put their face. No one of the administration, no one of the government can put their face in a meeting like this. So, I mean, if that is not a proof that there is an escapism and that they are not facing the problem, I don't know what is a proof of that. When you have a policy that no one defends, what is that?
So we do. So,
I was asked, why suddenly all presidents of Latin America are talking about drugs and saying that the U.S. policy is bad? Why that happened in such a short time? And so I have an answer. In the U.S., there is no one able to defend the policy they have in place anymore. They can say anything, and no one can answer from the U.S. administration. They can say anything. No one will say you are wrong. You are not right. What you are saying is wrong. No one. Who? I am who?
yeah, I feel like it goes to what Kathleen said about the Schedule 1 marijuana. People are saying so much stuff and things are moving so quickly. No one wants to stand up and say anything because it may be irrelevant by the week
or
after.
they come as in Brown and say, no, it's not true. There is no consumer of drugs in jail in the U.S.
That's
Oh,
ridiculous.
yeah, of course. We all believe that.
Who said this to you?
1,000 people in jail, and they are all traffickers. Yeah.
Who said this to you?
Sure. They say that. They say that. No, it's not true.
Yeah.
No one is taken to jail in the U.S. because of the consumption of drugs.
So forgive me. We're coming up on an hour here. I'm going to ask Hamilton one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. But before I open it up for questions, there'll be a moment where those of you who want to escape will be permitted to do so with a minimum of social sanction. But before the last question, Hamilton. So when people talk about this issue on the international level, it's always like Colombia and Mexico, and it becomes like a macro story very quickly, and it becomes about policy and how many tons of cocaine and giant arrows moving across the map. And I know you've done a lot of reporting on the ground, and you've interviewed drug users and drug traffickers, and I'm thinking of your Zimbabwe video where you were out in the fields where people are growing special strains of marijuana and taping it to the bottoms of their cars and taking it across borders. Is there anything from that, any takeaway from that you feel like translates to the policy level, or is there anything you feel like gets lost between the small picture and the big picture?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is that things have changed a lot in the last decade with the introduction of the internet. Things are moving very, very quickly, and the entire drug market has changed dramatically. There's sort of a case study that can be seen in the UK, where in the early 2000s, the quality of cocaine started to decline. There were lots of reports of cocaine containing a deworming agent called levamisole that was causing all sorts of weird opportunistic infections and users, and it was extremely expensive in addition to being impure. So cocaine became a less viable recreational drug. At the exact same time, people started to introduce these uncontrolled substances in the UK that became immensely, immensely popular. And that has just become a chain reaction that is continuing right to this moment. And what we find is that even if you are able to successfully control a substance, which does happen on occasion, it's rare, it happened with Quaaludes in the US, it happens on occasion, that something will always come to replace it, and often multiple things will come to replace it. And so it's becoming even more ridiculous than it was in the past, because there's so many targets that need to be kept in mind in order to maintain prohibition. It's truly impossible. If you just look at the number of Schedule I drugs that the DEA has at the moment, it's enormous.
How many, is it in the hundreds or thousands or?
It's over 50, and most of them are drugs that no one even uses. Drugs like 2CN. You know, this is
What
like
is 2CN?
It's an obscure psychedelic phenethylamine that probably like a dozen people on the planet have used.
How did it come to the government's attention?
I have no idea.
Uh-huh.
But I think this is sort of like representative of the fear that they have, that they don't know where to look anymore, that there's so many possibilities, that the information is disseminated so quickly on the internet, that people have become so sophisticated in these new drug systems where drugs are custom synthesized in labs in China and India as opposed to being grown in South America. And because it's a gray market, it's a lot harder to control, and because people can constantly evolve what is being sold, it's really getting into a
This sounds like a sales pitch for a larger enforcement budget to crack down on these new threats, right? I mean, how are we gonna? Well, anyway, okay. So anyone who'd like to head out, who wants to, if anyone wants to leave, if it's no one wants to leave, it's okay. Now's the time. Okay. This is so much fun. I promised. Yeah. You had a question. Yeah.
I'm Chris Glazik. I write about drug policy sometimes. And I am a strong proponent of drug legalization and a proud user of psychedelics and ketamine and whatever. But I'm asking, what do you say to people, and this includes a lot of very smart researchers, people like Keith Humphrey, mostly progressive, but what do you say to people who say we have a natural experiment with a drug legalization regime, essentially, effectively? We have this 10-year period in the United States when really opioids have been very widely available, and for a lot of people, effectively, doctors have been prescribing it. And what do you say to those people who say this has been an unparalleled disaster, that it's been far deadlier than any drug epidemic we've ever had, and that the data is just very, very not good? What's the simple way to address that?
I mean, I would address it by talking about another kind of living social experiment that we have, which has also wrought tremendous damage, which is the legalization of alcohol. I mean, we went through a prohibition experiment. Alcohol is the drug under which most people, it's the drug responsible for the most crime, either committed under the influence of or in order to get. Right? And there's no question but that when you legalize or decriminalize, and maybe at some point we'll have the opportunity to discuss the distinction between those two things, but there's no question but that you're risking increasing exposure to the drug. And Portugal, in fact, has reported that as a result of decriminalization, they do see more exposure to drugs that are highly potent, right? There's no going around that. I think that whole reservation stems from a view of the drug war as being about sanctioning certain drugs as okay and not okay. And my view of the drug war is, again, very agnostic and very policy-based, which is what we have now is so unjust and such a tragic failure that when I say let's decriminalize, and I actually say this in the preface of my book, I'm not one of these people who's, leading a valiant charge to get better and safer drugs and to celebrate, drug use in every way. All I'm saying is this is less bad. What we have now is a disaster, and let's move to something that's less bad. And alcohol, continues to pile up costs on our roadways, costs medically, costs criminally. But I don't think anyone would suggest that the way to solve those costs, so to speak, would be a return to prohibition.
Let's see. Yes. Oh no. Yeah. You.
I have a question for President Gaviria with regards to the Latin American states and leading up to the special session on drugs in the UN. Do you think there's going to, in 2016, do you think we're going to see some movement maybe towards reforming the conventions, or is it going to come from the ground up where we're going to start seeing countries like Uruguay and maybe other countries in the region just being in violation of the international framework?
I am optimistic about the debate. I am not optimistic at all about changing the conventions. Why? You know, one thing is like Western society, Latin America, Europe. But what is happening, there are a lot of countries in Asia where it's very difficult to work with them. You cannot ask for flexibility to Japan because of history, to China because of history, with Iran where they have that penalty, with Arab countries where they are totally, so to have a discussion and to look for a policy that is agreed by everyone and consensus, that is totally unviable. But people in Vienna, the organizations of the UN in Vienna, which have been the United Nations in Vienna, which have been totally defenders of prohibitionism, are starting to change. The statements they are doing is that we need a change, we need to be more practical, we need to look at the problems. There is a change of those institutions, and I think it's good. But to change the conventions is not a good idea. To start with, the most important thing, consumption. The conventions don't say you need to put people in jail or you need to use prohibition. They don't say that. They let that to your laws. So you can do anything, and the Europeans do anything they want without the convention. They are criticized, but they do anything they want.
They have to stop short of legalization, but they have decriminalized. Yeah.
Yeah, they have decriminalized. They can do. You can plant marijuana in Spain.
Maybe this is a good. What is the difference between decriminalization and legalization?
But I think that session will be useful. I think the debate will be useful. I don't expect any change in the convention, and I don't think that is useful, and I don't think it's a good path.
Okay, I want to get through as many questions as we can, but real quick, what is that distinction?
Legalization, you're saying it's okay from the point of production to the point of sale. Decriminalization, you're saying at the point of sale, under a certain amount, we won't arrest you for it.
Thank you.
That was quick.
Yeah.
The problem of Uruguay is that they establish provision that the state will provide the marijuana, and that is totally banned from the conventions, the production side. The real problem of Uruguay was not the legalization or whatever of marijuana. The real problem was providing the drug by the state, because that is totally banned from the conventions.
The gentleman in the brown jacket.
I'm an addictions physician from Sydney, Australia, and I wanted to thank the panelists for their descriptions and agree entirely that the drug problem all over is complex, but one part of it is relatively simple, as the President said, and that is opiate addiction, heroin addiction. And I have to blame members of my own profession in this country and in my country for avoiding proper treatment for opiate addiction, for providing methadone, buprenorphine in a circumstance that has modest psychosocial supports, which has dramatic effects on the lives of the addicts when it's available. No pharmacist in America is allowed to give a dose of methadone. But no physician in private practice in this country is allowed to write a prescription for methadone, which is unique in the Western world. It doesn't work perfectly in any of the other countries, including Australia.
I just want to interrupt because I see a lot of quizzical faces. It is dispensed in clinics, so that.
It's dispensed in clinics. In Vermont, for instance,
I'm going to kind of steer you towards a question soon. I appreciate what you're saying, but yeah.
We were just told in Vermont that there was methadone available. There's one clinic in the whole of Vermont. So that doctors writing prescriptions for OxyContin and morphine in an uncontrolled fashion is not treatment at all. But just to thank the panelists, I have a specific question.
Okay. Yeah, try to make it, questions are good, but I appreciate it. Yeah, please.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask is that as far as what you guys were talking about, how the political establishment is not really talking about the drug policy and the failed, maybe my question is maybe it might be because there's broader geopolitical issues at our state in terms of the implementation of the drug war, and how maybe the political establishment is not really concerned with decreasing the use, but maybe they're more concerned with.
Does the drug war serve other geopolitical interests? If that's it, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, my book explicitly argues that it does, so.
The real problem is, in this country, crime and narco trafficking are almost the same. And any politician that talks about drugs is immediately called soft on crime. And that is, you don't survive that. I do understand that that is the argument. They cannot talk about this because they look soft on crime. And you cannot look in America, in the US, soft on crime. And that has been created like a dynamics that is better not to talk about that because I don't want to take the risk of being soft on crime. That is I do understand that that is the reason they keep silent.
Yeah, but my question, I mean, is
Uh-huh.
that, for example, the role of the drug war on the influence of the U.S. on world affairs.
Yes.
For example, that the drug war enables the United States to enter areas and support militarily different regimes in saying, look, we're gonna combat drugs. That's my question, is the broader geopolitical implications that doesn't enable the political establishment to really talk about the failings of the war itself.
The war on drugs is important in very few countries. I mean, out of the US and Mexico and Colombia and probably Central America, 2 or 3 countries, there is no talk on war on drugs. There is a talk on drug policy, but not on war on drugs. That is important. In Europe, it's a non-issue. It's a non-issue, really. It's a non-issue. So I don't think geopolitically this is important. And in Asia, you better don't talk about this. Not in Russia, not in Japan, not in China, for many reasons. So I don't think there is a geopolitical problem behind that. I don't think so.
I'm gonna speed things up. We're gonna go until 8:10, maybe just 8:05, and we're gonna go as quickly as possible. So keep your questions short and your answers short, and we're gonna try to get through all of them. Yeah.
I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. I believe, and I think most people would probably agree, part of the reason we got the 21st Amendment was that rich white people liked alcohol, and that part of the reason you guys have used the word momentum quite a few times tonight, part of the reason there's so much momentum, at least in the marijuana movement, is that right now, rich Caucasians happen to like marijuana. My question is...
So it's a fashion almost, yeah.
That's what I'm going, is when the war on marijuana ends, and when marijuana is legal in most or all places in the U.S., what's going to happen to the legalization movement and to the other drugs when rich white Americans don't take heroin and LSD and don't care?
Yeah,
Wonderful
by the
question.
way-
Thank you.
By the way, rich white Americans do take heroin, just by the way. Rich white people like their alcohol and they like their money more. And part of the impetus for repealing prohibition came from the fact that at that point in time, most Americans did not pay a federal income tax. Only very rich people did. And alcohol as an excise tax or an indirect tax levied against a certain class of goods was a real revenue generator for the United States government. And so rich people joined in a coalition to repeal prohibition, in part because they were afraid that they would be paying more taxes if prohibition was sustained, and they wanted a return to alcohol. So this is only just to add another layer to your question, which is part of the problem that I see when we shifted from a taxing regime to a criminal punishment regime, is who feels the costs of the drug war. And I mean that in very literal ways, and I mean it in very metaphorical ways as well.
Yes.
So this question is mostly for you, I guess, since you studied the history of it, because I'm curious about what the future might look like if we have like decentralized software like this Asana that kind of takes the political power away from people who move at a much slower pace than computers can. So if you have like decentralized political power, if you have decentralized monetary systems, then the war, which is primarily a weapon of political regimes to raise money, if those things are all of a sudden decentralized, what do you think the future could look like in terms of getting drugs?
Yeah, I haven't pictured the drug war in a Bitcoin world, I have to say. But I do appreciate the question. Right now, we're seeing the states, you know, as the historians always quote, Louis Brandeis saying as the laboratories of reform, and we are seeing progress on those fronts, that it's being hastened, if not demanded, by people in the states. You know, in the United States, I guess I have to respectfully disagree with the president, because I do very much agree with the questioner here, which is that the drug war has been a set of tools, a set of policy tools, sometimes up into including military intervention. And I think, you know, Matt and I have talked separately about a piece I wrote for the NSA, and we could talk about the war on terror in a similar way too, which is, I don't think we should underestimate the kind of global power that U.S. officialdom wields abroad and the kind of legitimacy that those kinds of escapades have at home. Most Americans are not aware of what's being done in their name, and in order to elicit their support for global ascendancies and projects on the scale that we conduct routinely, we have these boogeymen, right? We have these boogeymen. And my fear is that there'll be a new boogeyman, to answer your question. There'll be a new thing to fear in order to justify and explain the kind of U.S. government adventurism abroad, both that which is known and that which is unknown.
Thank you. Yeah, let's keep going. Oh, yeah.
I want to make 2 comments. One, economic issues are becoming important in this discussion and are a way of some people becoming into this discussion. The fiscal issues in California have been very clear. I mean, about taxation, about if we are going to give more money to schools and education or to jails. I mean, things that, and many people not to enter in this type of debate are starting to get into economic issues, saying, well, this is not. Pat Robertson, this old guy, very respected man, say, about 2 years ago, he went out and said, well, we cannot be spending so much money in something that is not working. It's too much money, we are in the fiscal crisis, so let's stop this. I thought someone was going to answer him. No one answered him in the Republican Party or in any party. No one answered him. So these are ways of entering the discussion of these issues. The other thing is there is a strong opposition on the police establishment, on the judges and the judicial system, on the people who build up jails and administer jails, opposition to any change in policy. There are big interests behind not only geopolitical, there is an internal opposition, a big opposition to changes in the policy.
Okay, I think we're gonna do 2 more questions, and then we'll be done. Yes, you, sir, with the laptop. Yeah.
There are 3 models that are arising to as an alternative to provision. One is the Uruguayan model with the public state, public-run operation. The other one is the so-called alcohol model that was in Washington and Colorado. And the other one is the European model, which, as you well described, it doesn't really offer a solution for the production side. I was wondering which one of these 3 models is the one that you look as the best option.
Yeah, why don't we go down the line, or so which of the 3 or none of the above, and yeah, why don't you start, President Gaviria?
No, I have sympathy for what Uruguay has done. When you don't face the problem of production and providing drugs to people, and it's true also about Portugal, you keep having people that go to crime to get money to buy drugs, and you keep buying drugs to mafias. So you have to face that problem. Here in marijuana, it's very simple. They have let the cultivation of marijuana almost free in the U.S. So, but you have to face the problem of providing drugs in a way that is not by mafias. And any model or any real solution has to pass for a way of that there has to be a legal provision of drugs.
Decriminalization isn't enough. You also you have the whole.
Decriminalization is not enough. It's not enough. I mean, in Latin America, they don't put people in jail just because of the consumption of drugs. The real problem is crime and insecurity behind that.
Which of the 3 would you endorse or not?
Well, I think decriminalization is certainly necessary because of all, marijuana is an exception in that there's so many people willing to stand up for it. There are so many other drugs, as was alluded to previously, like LSD, that are immensely important scientifically, especially, that no one is going to campaign to have legalized. And people say, oh, prohibition doesn't work, it doesn't do anything, people still use the drugs. Well, it definitely works on scientists. That's one type of person that is without question impacted by prohibition. And if a drug is scheduled,
What they do real quick? Why is LSD important scientifically? That's just not. I know you're.
It's important in psychopharmacology. It's important for studying the 5-HT2A receptor, for studying cluster headaches, studying depression, studying consciousness. It has a lot of.
Right. Yeah. No. I just know you know this stuff very well. So please go.
There's there's all these scheduled substances that no one is ever going to stand up for, and that are very important scientifically and are essentially inaccessible without going through all sorts of bureaucratic hurdles. And unless there's a blanket decriminalization of all these things that they can be used scientifically, a lot of the most negative ramifications of the drug war are going to stick around for a long time.
And Kathleen, which are the three?
I support legalization of marijuana, and I support decriminalization of other Schedule I drugs, and I also support a return to the pre-1970 Controlled Substances Act, which would include, and it's not commonly known, that heroin is a legal medicine in Great Britain. I support a regime in which we return to a kind of opium monopoly that we had prior to the 1971 convention, the 1961 convention. I would support a return to a legal monopoly because I believe once you create a monopoly of existing producers, you can effectively manipulate trade through the mechanics of trade, but you cannot punish a market out of existence.
And then next, last question. Let's see, a lot of questions out there. In the very back, please. Yeah.
How would you recommend we engage our politicians on the issue? I mean, I know it's so complex and like what we see in the mainstream media is so sort of black and white, but obviously there's so much, that we need to sort of talk about drugs.
Well, one thing that I've done, and this isn't just a shameless plug because he's here, but one thing that I did through the course of my research on writing this book on the drug war was to become a dues-paying member of the Drug Policy Alliance, and the director is here. He was here, he left. So that's even better because he won't know about my shameless plug. But the Drug Policy Alliance is great because they track all different kinds of reform. They're very mindful of the importance of pushing the marijuana policy portfolio, for instance, but they're also mindful that that's not all there is to the drug war. And they're great at congratulating the Obama administration on saying things like Good Samaritan laws should be passed throughout the various states and you should encourage that, but they're also great about saying there's a race bias to the drug war, drug courts don't work, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, it's a very simplistic answer to what I think is a complex question, but I know that I resolved a lot of those issues just by becoming a dues payer member of the Drug Policy Alliance.
And do either of you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I think there's an overemphasis. Of course, politicians have a huge influence on all of this, but I think that people need to have a personal responsibility in the way they conduct themselves, and journalists also have an enormous responsibility. When you look at the history of a lot of the drugs that have been scheduled, it has to do with the action of individuals who are not politicians. Salvinorin A was scheduled largely by a mother named Kathy Chidester, who thought that her son's suicide was responsible. She thought Salvinorin A was responsible for her son's suicide. It's true of many other drugs. 2CT7 was scheduled essentially because of one Rolling Stone article written by a journalist who just, wrote this as a frivolous thing, and the result is that a very important drug that could be used in scientific research is now no longer available. So people have a responsibility to behave maturely with drugs and to understand that every time that a politician feels that they can gain some political traction by demonizing drugs, they will do that. The moment that politicians don't feel that they can get votes by being hard on drugs, they will change. I think a lot of the journalists that say negative things about drugs and the politicians that say negative things about drugs are entirely ambivalent. Nancy Reagan just chose all this Just Say No stuff because she didn't have anything to do in the White House and was being criticized because she spent $200,000 on new plates. And that's true.
That's the only reason. Okay, yeah. No, please.
I talk about the importance of research, but I want to go further than that. One of the problems of dealing with the drug issues, it's there is no real information about drug issues. It's not reliable, they are manipulated, there are no independent sources, prevention campaigns are never tested, and there are good cases in the US where it's very clear that prevention campaigns, because are organized by narcotics, anti-narcotics people, they are not tested, they do spots, ads that are good for non-consumers of drugs, but bad. Don't say anything for the people that use drugs. There is not university checking that the policies are really follow up. So information about, for example, the markets of drugs, I mean, all numbers are invented. The czar of drugs can say anything. He just, in a difficult moment, say, no, the price of drugs, the price of cocaine in the streets of LA increased 50%. So we have been successful. What is that? Successful of what? What is the use of that? I mean, and they keep doing that. So one of the very important things to advance in drug policy, to have an intelligent policy, to know what is happening, to do trial and error, is we need research, we need independent sources of information, we need more NGOs involved in following policies like Drug Policy Alliance. We really need that. It's very difficult. This is a very complex problem, and it's very difficult to design good policy without good information, without good research, social research, medical research. The only people I have heard really good at treatment are Australians. They have brought some Australian doctors to some of our meetings, and they have said very intelligent. I never heard that, but from Australian guys. But and they don't believe in prevention. They only believe in treatment. They say, we believe in treatment. We believe in treatment. Probably they are right. The approach should be treatment and not so, but a lot of treatment. Maybe they are right. But if you go to look about prevention, about treatment, you find very little. You don't find enough information about this. So for example, I was in a meeting in a university in Bogota just last week. Say we need a small amount of money to look for and they were biologists, the genome of cocaine. Well, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to do that. I mean, we should be doing that. We shouldn't find difficulty in finding some money to do research. They don't have it.
So
And no one is
better
doing it.
data and funding for research.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, information is very poor. Is not of good quality. It's because it's not enough research. Because the information is in hands that are not trustable enough. They are not. In many countries, not only in the U.S. Probably in the U.S. they are better, but in no country are in good hands. The information about consumption is done by anti-narcotics authority. So they all time say, no, here we don't have consumption, which is false. And they say it about Mexico and they say about Colombia, and it's not true. There is a lot of consumption but information is in the hands of anti-narcotics authorities. The people who go to Vienna to represent countries in the UN system, all of them are anti-narcotic authorities. They don't send a doctor, they don't send a diplomatic guy, they don't say, they only send, so policy is in the hands of anti-narcotic officers.
So how do you get the two sides in the same room? I tried to do that today and it didn't work. How would you go? No, seriously, how do you do it if it's all these people?
No. The anti-narcotic officers, they are hiding from this discussion all the time. They only care about what they do.
Well, they're
keep
probably
doing the
in
same,
Austria saying
which
that
is
you're
the
hiding.
policy. Yeah.
I think
No,
that,
I hope that meeting in the UN will be useful. The debate will be useful of having a debate. Not what they do in Vienna, that is just defend prohibitionism. I mean, Bolivia had to go out of the convention just to accept that their indigenous people could, how do you say, chew their cocaine leaf, and then come back. They didn't let Bolivia to put their reserve. No, that was impossible. That they obliged Bolivia to get out of the convention, do that. I mean, it's stupid. It's so stupid what they did, but they did it. I mean, to accept something that is so obvious obvious, totally obvious. The indigenous people do that. You know, they are trying to accept that in Jamaica they are going to consume marijuana. It's part of their culture. Always in Jamaica, the Bob Marley and his people, they use marijuana since. So to ban marijuana in Jamaica was a stupid thing from the beginning.
Yeah, they still talk about it in the papers. The ganja problem is what the Gleaner calls it. I'm just going to do a last-minute plug. Anyone who's interested in the differences between powder cocaine and chewing leaf cocaine, which come up a few times. There's a wonderful story in the New Yorker archive by Dr. Andrew Weil. It's actually the only piece he ever wrote for the New Yorker, and he actually goes to an Andean village and observes it first while they're chewing the leaf, and then later after the introduction of powder. And it appears, and when on my read, it's the product of months of research, and it's a wonderful piece, and I'd highly recommend it. Well, thank you. Thank the three of you for coming. I really appreciate it, yeah.